The soft hum of the jet engines filled the cabin as the first-class passengers settled into their luxurious leather seats. Among them was a man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in a sharp navy suit that screamed importance. His name was Daniel Wexler, a hedge fund manager who thrived on success and flaunted it wherever he went. He leaned back, sipping a glass of champagne with a smug grin as he scrolled through emails on his phone. Across the aisle, an older man quietly took his seat. He wore a worn leather jacket over a simple button-up shirt and carried a presence that was understated, yet somehow commanding. His silver hair glistened under the soft cabin lights, and his weathered face carried lines that told stories of a life well lived. Yet, to Daniel, he was just another passenger, a nobody. As the flight attendants moved about, ensuring every passenger was comfortable, Daniel couldn't help but notice the older man casually flipping through a dog-eared paperback. Daniel sneered inwardly. "Who even reads books anymore?" he thought, glancing at his Rolex. The man seemed so out of place in the pristine bubble of first class, and Daniel's curiosity quickly turned into judgment. Leaning toward the attendant, Daniel muttered just loud enough for the man to hear, "I didn't realize first class had gone so lenient with its standards." The older man glanced up from his book, offering a polite smile but saying nothing. His calm demeanor only fueled Daniel's irritation. For a moment, the cabin felt heavy with the unspoken tension, and a couple of nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. What Daniel didn't know was that this stranger wasn't just anyone. The truth about who he had just insulted was about to turn his smugness into shame, and it would happen in a way he'd never forget. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. Daniel leaned back in his plush seat, tapping his polished shoe impatiently against the floor. The flight attendants were offering the pre-flight menu, but his attention kept wandering to the man across the aisle. There was something about him, his unbothered demeanor, the quiet confidence with which he sat there flipping through that ragged old book. It annoyed Daniel to no end. First class isn't meant for people like him. It's meant for people like me. People who've earned it. He glanced out the window, the fading sunlight casting golden hues over the runway. But even the serene view did little to temper the irritation bubbling within him. How can someone dress like they just walked out of a thrift store and feel comfortable here? He thought, stealing another glance. His internal monologue was interrupted by the sound of light laughter from another passenger. Daniel turned to see a flight attendant chatting briefly with the older man, her expression warm and even a little starstruck. Daniel frowned. Why is she giving him so much attention? He shook his head, chalking it up to pity. That's when he noticed something else. The older man's hands. They weren't the smooth, manicured hands of someone accustomed to luxury. They were rough, scarred, and calloused, like they had spent decades working under the sun or gripping something with intensity. The sight only deepened Daniel's disdain. Must have saved every penny he had for this seat, he thought with a smug smirk. He leaned toward the attendant again, speaking just loud enough to draw attention. "Excuse me, could you bring me another glass of champagne? Some of us actually belong here." The older man didn't react, but Daniel swore he saw the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, something that didn't sit well. For the first time, a strange unease crept into Daniel's chest, though he quickly brushed it off. What Daniel didn't realize was that this seemingly ordinary man wasn't just ignoring him. He was waiting, and when the truth finally came out, Daniel would wish he'd kept his mouth shut. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign," the flight attendant announced as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Passengers shifted in their seats, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the first-class cabin. Daniel swirled his champagne lazily, glancing at the older man who was now staring out the window with a far-off look in his eyes. What could someone like him possibly have to think so deeply about? Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. The man's mere presence had become an itch Daniel couldn't stop scratching. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned with a tray of refreshments and paused briefly by the older man. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Eastwood?" she asked, her tone unusually warm and deferential. Daniel's ears perked up. He froze mid-sip, his mind racing. Mr. Eastwood? The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. His curiosity now bordered on obsession. "Actually, I'll take a coffee." "Black," the older man replied, his voice calm but unmistakably commanding. The attendant smiled and nodded, quickly walking off to fulfill the request. That's when Daniel couldn't hold back any longer. "Eastwood, huh?" he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Guess you're trying to sound important. Let me guess, you're some small-town mayor or the owner of a used car dealership." His tone dripped with mockery. A couple of passengers glanced over uncomfortably, but the older man remained silent, his face unreadable. That only made Daniel bolder. "You know," Daniel continued, leaning forward with a smug grin, "it's funny how some people think money can buy class, but it can't buy respect." The man turned his gaze to Daniel, locking eyes with him for the first time. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a piercing calm that made Daniel shift slightly in his seat. The man finally spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "Young man," he said, his tone carrying a weight Daniel couldn't quite describe, "you should choose your words carefully. You never know who you're talking to." The statement hung in the air, unsettling in its simplicity. Daniel chuckled awkwardly, brushing it off. "Oh, don't worry. I think I've got you figured out," he replied, trying to reclaim his confidence. But as the older man turned back to his window, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a mistake that was about to unravel in ways he couldn't imagine. The tension in the cabin lingered like an unspoken challenge, thick and heavy. Daniel's smug demeanor faltered as he noticed the glances exchanged among the nearby passengers. Some looked amused, others uncomfortable. Yet no one said a word. "Why does it feel like I'm missing something?" he wondered, his grip tightening around the stem of his champagne glass. Determined not to let the older man's cryptic response get the better of him, Daniel leaned forward again. "You've got quite the attitude for someone who's clearly out of his depth," he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let me guess, this is your first time flying first class? Did you win the lottery or something?" The older man remained composed, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "It's not my first time," he replied simply, his tone unbothered. That calmness, so unshakable, so resolute, made Daniel's blood boil. He was used to commanding respect, to being the loudest and most important voice in the room. But this man had the audacity to ignore him, as though Daniel's words held no weight. "What do you even do?" Daniel pressed, his voice rising slightly. "Because I'll tell you what I do. I run a multi-million-dollar hedge fund. I make decisions that change markets. That's the kind of person who belongs in this seat. But you're clearly no one important." The older man finally looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Daniel thought he might respond, but instead, he simply tilted his head and gave a small, knowing smile. It wasn't mocking, but it wasn't apologetic either. It was as if the man knew something Daniel didn't. Before Daniel could press further, the flight attendant returned, a nervous smile on her face. She handed the older man his coffee and, as if unable to contain herself, said, "I just want to say, it's such an honor to have you on this flight, Mr. Eastwood. My dad is a huge fan of your work." The room seemed to tilt. Daniel blinked, his mind scrambling to process what he'd just heard. Fan? Work? He glanced around, noticing a few passengers nodding in quiet recognition. It hit him like a freight train. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. He let out a forced laugh, trying to cover his growing unease. "Eastwood? As in Clint Eastwood?" His words hung in the air, and for the first time the older man's expression shifted, just slightly. "Is there a problem with that?" Clint asked, his voice calm but with an edge that cut through Daniel's bravado like a knife. Daniel's stomach sank, his confidence crumbling as the weight of his mistake settled in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. And just as he was about to stammer an apology, Clint leaned back in his seat, that same piercing gaze locked on Daniel. "Careful what you assume, kid," Clint said, his tone steady but sharp, "because the truth has a funny way of humbling people like you." The cabin fell silent. Daniel's face burned with embarrassment, but the worst was yet to come. For a moment, the world around Daniel seemed to pause, his thoughts racing in a chaotic loop. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood? His palms grew clammy as he replayed every condescending word he had just thrown at the man. A sickening wave of regret washed over him, but his ego fought to stay afloat. Trying to salvage the situation, Daniel forced a nervous laugh. "Oh, wow, Clint Eastwood. I didn't realize. I guess I didn't recognize you without the cameras or, the cowboy hat." His voice cracked on the last word, drawing a few suppressed chuckles from nearby passengers. Clint didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and fixed Daniel with a gaze so intense it felt as though it could pierce straight through him. "You think a man's worth is determined by what he's wearing? By how many zeros are in his bank account?" Clint's voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of decades of experience. Daniel swallowed hard, his usual quick wit failing him. I didn't mean—" "Save it," Clint interrupted, holding up a hand. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Young, arrogant, thought the world revolved around him. You want to know what happened to him?" Daniel could barely manage a nod, his throat tightening. Clint leaned back, his expression unreadable. "He lost everything. Because when you judge people based on surface-level nonsense, you miss the things that truly matter. Respect, character, integrity." His words hit Daniel like a sledgehammer, each one cutting deeper than the last. The cabin was deathly silent, every passenger hanging on Clint's words. And then, as if to twist the knife, Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. He scribbled something onto a napkin and handed it to the flight attendant. "Here," he said calmly, "make sure this gets to my seatmate." The attendant nodded, clearly starstruck, and passed the napkin to Daniel. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. Scrawled in bold, unmistakable handwriting were the words, "You should watch who you talk down to. Some of us wrote the stories people like you pay to escape to." Below, it was Clint's signature, an autograph Daniel knew he didn't deserve. As the weight of Clint's words and actions settled in, Daniel's chest tightened with a mix of shame and realization. But Clint wasn't finished. "You may have money, kid," Clint said, his voice cutting through the silence, "but that doesn't make you rich." And with that, Clint turned his gaze back to the window, leaving Daniel to sit in stunned silence, the gravity of his mistake sinking deeper with every second. But the moment wasn't over yet. What came next would change Daniel forever. The hum of the plane's engines seemed deafening now, filling the void of Daniel's silence. He stared at the napkin in his hands, Clint Eastwood's signature glaring back at him like a reminder of every word he wished he could take back. His chest felt heavy, and for the first time in years, Daniel was at a loss for words. He replayed the exchange over and over in his mind, each detail cutting deeper into his pride. The smug comments, the assumptions, the disrespect. It all felt so small and hollow now. The man he'd insulted wasn't just some unassuming stranger. He was an icon, someone who had lived a life far richer in experiences than Daniel could ever imagine. Daniel looked up, his gaze drifting across the cabin. The other passengers had gone back to their conversations, but he could feel their lingering judgment. He wasn't the successful, self-assured businessman he'd built himself up to be in their eyes. No, he was the man who had tried to belittle Clint Eastwood and failed miserably. His mind wandered back to Clint's words. "You may have money, but that doesn't make you rich." They echoed in his head, louder with each repetition. What does make someone rich, then? He wondered, the question gnawing at him. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing over at Clint, who sat calmly by the window, seemingly unbothered. How could someone exude so much power without saying much at all? Daniel felt small in comparison, his flashy lifestyle and arrogance reduced to meaningless fluff in the shadow of Clint's quiet confidence. The napkin in his hand was damp now, crumpled from his nervous grip. Slowly, he smoothed it out on his tray table, as if trying to preserve the last shred of dignity he had left. He wanted to apologize, to say something that might redeem him, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound shallow? As the flight attendants began serving lunch, Daniel noticed Clint quietly declining his meal. Instead, he pulled out a notebook, the kind worn with age, and began jotting something down. Daniel's curiosity was piqued, but he didn't dare ask. He felt like an intruder in the presence of someone who clearly operated on a level far beyond his understanding. For the remainder of the flight, Daniel sat in silence, his mind churning. He thought about the people he'd judged, the opportunities he'd missed because he'd been too focused on appearances. For years, he'd convinced himself that success was defined by wealth and status. But now, sitting next to a man who had achieved legendary status yet carried himself with such humility, Daniel was beginning to see how wrong he'd been. As the plane began its descent, Daniel's heart pounded. He wanted to say something to Clint before they landed, but every time he opened his mouth, the words died before they could form. Finally, as the seatbelt sign dinged on, Daniel turned toward Clint, his voice low and tentative. Mr. Eastwood, I just want to say I'm sorry for everything I said earlier. Clint looked up from his notebook, his eyes soft but unreadable. He studied Daniel for a moment, then gave a small nod. Apology accepted, he said simply, then turned his attention back to the page. The simplicity of the response struck Daniel harder than he expected. It wasn't forgiveness he hadn't earned. It was a reminder that some lessons don't come with fanfare. And as the plane touched down, Daniel realized the weight of this moment wouldn't leave him anytime soon. But the most important realization was still waiting for him as they prepared to disembark. As the plane taxied to the gate, Daniel sat still, clutching the signed napkin like a relic. The man he had ridiculed had just taught him one of the most profound lessons of his life. Not through retaliation or anger, but with a simple demonstration of dignity. It wasn't just Clint Eastwood's fame that struck Daniel. It was the quiet power of his humility and self-assurance. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the familiar shuffle of post-flight chaos filling the cabin. Daniel hesitated, watching Clint pack his notebook into a weathered leather bag. Something about the bag, scuffed and well-traveled, symbolized the life Clint had lived, a life of stories, struggles, and wisdom earned through decades of experience. Daniel couldn't let the moment slip away without acknowledging what he had learned. Summoning every ounce of courage, he stood up and extended a hand. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood," he said sincerely, his voice steady this time. "Not just for accepting my apology, but for reminding me what really matters." Clint paused, looking at Daniel's outstretched hand before shaking it firmly. His grip was strong, his eyes unwavering. "The real question is," Clint said, his tone calm but pointed, "what are you going to do with that reminder?" The words struck Daniel like a final hammer blow. He nodded slowly, understanding what Clint meant. This wasn't just about acknowledging his mistake. It was about changing the way he saw the world, the way he treated people, the way he lived. As Clint walked down the aisle, disappearing into the crowd of passengers, Daniel stood frozen for a moment, watching him leave. It felt like the end of an encounter that would shape the rest of his life. Later, as he sat in the back of his car on the way to his next meeting, Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out his tablet. Instead of diving into stock charts and market reports, he stared at the blank Notes app. Slowly, he typed the words respect, character, integrity. He sat back, staring at the screen. For years, his life had revolved around numbers and prestige, but now, something deeper tugged at him. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a transformation. He vowed to lead his life differently, to value the things that couldn't be measured in dollars or success. And as the car rolled through the bustling city streets, Daniel realized that the wealth he'd been chasing all these years wasn't the kind that came from money. It came from moments like these, moments of humility, clarity, and growth. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt truly rich. And so, Daniel's story reminds us all of a powerful truth. Sometimes it takes a moment of humility to open our eyes to what really matters in life. Respect, character, and integrity aren't just words. They're the foundation of how we connect with others and leave a lasting impact. Have you ever judged someone too quickly or let appearances cloud your perspective? What lessons did you learn from it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use this reminder. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the wealth we accumulate. It's about the legacy we leave behind.